We are stepping straight into the war room today because, well, the geopolitical ground is fundamentally shifting beneath our feet right now.
It really is.
Yeah, I mean, following that recent terror attack in Pahalgam, Pakistan made an announcement that frankly set off alarm bells across the entire security establishment.
Oh, absolutely.
They stated they are placing the historic 1972 Simla Agreement, quote, in abeyance.
Right. Which is basically a very polite, legalistic way of saying they are temporarily suspending the core treaty. The treaty that has dictated the rules of engagement between India and Pakistan for, what, half a century now?
Yeah, 50 years.
And so we aren't just looking at a routine diplomatic spat here. This is a structural breakdown. It immediately threatens the stability of the line of control, or the LoC, and it forces a massive recalibration of India's entire border security architecture.
And that is the exact mission for this deep dive. If you're listening to this, you likely already track South Asian geopolitics, or maybe you're trying to build a rigorous analytical framework around national security.
Exactly. You need to understand the structural pattern here.
Right. We're going to strip away the sensational headlines and map out the real-world implications. We need to look at the threat of internationalizing the Kashmir conflict, the revival of proxy warfare, and the incredibly complex technological and grassroots countermeasures currently being deployed.
So to really gauge the threat level of this extension, we have to look backward for a moment. We have to map out the specific historical structural problem this treaty was actually designed to solve.
Let's anchor this in the history, because the context of 1972 is, well, it's dramatic. The Simla Agreement didn't just happen in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
It was signed on July 2nd, 1972 in Shimla by Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and Pakistani President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And the trigger for this meeting was the sheer devastation of the 1971 India-Pakistan War.
Right, a war that culminated in a decisive Indian military victory. I mean, it fundamentally redrew the map of South Asia with the creation of Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan.
Yeah.
So India walked into that summit in Shimla holding an unprecedented amount of leverage.
And I want to emphasize the scale of that leverage for you, because the numbers are staggering. India was holding over 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war.
That is a massive number.
When you process that figure, 93,000 soldiers and personnel captured, you realize that isn't a border skirmish. That is the wholesale collapse of an army.
Right.
So India holds these prisoners, they hold the territory, and they use that leverage to essentially force a new geopolitical firewall.
And the architecture of that firewall relied on a few brilliant legal maneuvers. Prior to 1972, Pakistan frequently leaned on United Nations Security Council Resolution 47.
Which had called for a plebiscite in Kashmir.
Right, exactly. But the Simla Agreement practically neutralized that UN avenue. It explicitly bound both nations to resolve all their differences through peaceful bilateral negotiations.
The operative word there being bilateralism.
Bilateralism,
Yeah.
yes. It legally locked the door from the inside. It meant Pakistan couldn't just run to a third party or a global referee every time there was a dispute.
It was just the two nations in the room sorting it out.
Right. Furthermore, it transformed the physical reality on the ground. The old 1971 ceasefire line in Jammu and Kashmir was officially renamed the Line of Control.
Okay.
And both sides committed in writing to not alter it unilaterally, regardless of mutual differences.
And to respect each other's territorial integrity.
Spot on. And in exchange for this solid commitment to bilateralism and the LoC, India released those 93,000 prisoners.
So if the Simla Agreement was the mechanism that locked the door, placing it in abeyance means Pakistan is essentially trying to pick the lock.
That's a great way to put it.
Let's move into the strategic impact of this. What happens when that firewall actually drops?
Well, the immediate predictable tactic is a pivot from bilateralism back to internationalization. By stating they no longer feel bound by the 1972 framework, Pakistan is signaling its intent to drag external players back onto the board. We can expect aggressive diplomatic campaigns to pull the United Nations back into the fray, or to leverage allies like China, or to elevate the issue within the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC.
They want a crowded room again.
Exactly.
But history tells us that diplomatic noise is usually a smokescreen for physical escalation. I'm thinking about the concept of nuclear brinkmanship here.
Absolutely.
Because both these nations are nuclear armed, a full-scale conventional war is theoretically off the table. I mean, it's mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
So instead, the conflict gets pushed down into subconventional proxy warfare.
And that is the profound concern for the defense establishment right now. It is not that Pakistani tanks will suddenly roll across the border. It's the cover of brinkmanship.
Right.
The strategy relies on the assumption that India won't risk a massive retaliation for lower-level militant infiltrations because of the nuclear umbrella.
And we know this playbook because the Simla Agreement hasn't been a flawless shield. Pakistan has tested it before.
Oh, many times.
Most notably, with the covert infiltrations that led to the 1984 Siachen conflict
Right.
and the 1999 Kargil War. The fear is that officially suspending the treaty is a green light for those exact proxy tactics to ramp up again.
And, we have to connect this border instability to the domestic reality inside India.
Let's interlink that, yeah.
A porous, volatile line of control bleeds directly into domestic governance. Think about the developmental and democratic consolidation efforts currently taking place in Jammu and Kashmir.
Especially following the abrogation of Article 370.
Exactly. The Indian government has staked a lot on projecting normalcy, attracting investment, and holding local elections.
Right, because if you are an international company looking to invest in infrastructure in J&K, a spike in proxy warfare is going to make you pull your capital out immediately.
Instantly.
National security is the absolute prerequisite for economic development.
It paralyzes the local economy if it fails, and the fallout doesn't stop at the domestic borders either. A bilateral fracture of this magnitude bleeds outward into regional diplomacy.
Like SARC.
Yes, multilateral forums like the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SARC, become totally paralyzed. You cannot have meaningful collective agreements on counterterrorism or regional trade when the two largest members are in a state of suspended hostility.
Okay, so the threat matrix is clear for us. We have the looming internationalization of the conflict, the specter of nuclear brinkmanship covering a proxy war, and the subsequent threat to domestic development in J&K.
Right.
How does the military and administrative apparatus actually respond to this? Let's analyze India's tactical countermeasures from a war room perspective.
Well, the response is a fascinating transition from relying on a diplomatic treaty to relying on a multidimensional defense posture.
Okay.
It breaks down into three critical areas: aggressive technology adoption, institutional strengthening, and grassroots capacity building.
Let's start with the technology, because when we talk about border security today, we aren't just talking about rolling out miles of barbed wire.
Not at all.
The source material highlights a massive pivot toward anti-drone defense systems, specifically the integration of Israeli Drone Dome technology. And I want to unpack how this actually works, because it's brilliant.
Please do. It's an absolute game changer for vertical security.
People hear Drone Dome, and they picture this physical, sci-fi force field over a military base.
Yeah, like a giant glass bubble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's actually an electronic warfare system.
Right.
When militants launch a drone carrying weapons or narcotics across the LoC, the drone dome uses this advanced 360-degree radar to detect it, often before it even crosses the border.
Which is crucial for early warning.
Yeah. Then, instead of shooting a missile at it, it uses radio frequency jamming. It essentially screams static over the specific frequency the pilot is using to steer the drone, severing the connection.
So the drone just goes blind.
Right. It loses its GPS and just drops out of the sky.
Which is vital, because neutralizing a drone carrying explosives with a kinetic weapon, like shooting it down, might detonate the payload over a populated area.
Oh, right.
The electronic jamming neutralizes the threat safely. And this Israeli tech is being integrated with India's own unmanned aerial vehicles, particularly the Heron TP drones, which provide seamless 247 high-altitude monitoring.
So you have Heron TP drones watching from the sky and drone domes protecting the airspace from below.
Yes.
But the infiltration still primarily happens on the ground. This brings us to the CIBMS, the Comprehensive Integrated Border Management System. This is where I have to push back a bit on the optimism of the defense briefings.
The implementation gap. It is always the hardest part to swallow. What stands out to you as the primary hurdle?
The sheer geography. I mean, the CIBMS is designed to replace physical fences with a smart fence. We're talking infrared sensors, laser walls, and underground seismic detectors that pick up the vibrations of footsteps.
Right.
That sounds incredible in a laboratory. But the active infiltration routes are places like Gurez, Uri, and Poonch. Have you seen the terrain in Gurez in January?
It is some of the most rugged, unforgiving mountainous terrain on the planet. Sub-zero temperatures, massive snowdrifts, constant avalanches.
Exactly. So how do you keep the batteries running on a thermal camera in negative 20 degrees Celsius? How does a seismic sensor tell the difference between a militant digging a tunnel and a herd of mountain goats walking over a ridge.
The false positive rate alone seems like it would overwhelm the operators.
Right. You can't just throw delicate Silicon Valley tech at the Himalayas and expect it to work flawlessly.
You've identified the core limitation of the technological response right there. The resource constraints and environmental challenges are massive. Now, the government's solution to the false positive problem relies heavily on artificial intelligence.
Okay, how so?
The raw data from the seismic sensors and the thermal cameras is fed into AI algorithms trained to recognize the specific gait and movement patterns of humans versus animals.
Oh, wow. Gait analysis.
Yes. But even with AI, the technology is prone to blind spots in severe weather.
Which means you can never fully remove the human element. The tech can't do it alone.
It cannot. And that brings us to the second and third pillars of the response: institutional strengthening and capacity building. To back up the CIBMS, the government is refining the multi-layered counter-infiltration grid.
What does that grid look like in practice?
It's a highly integrated command structure that blends the Army, the Border Security Force, local police units, and intelligence agencies, so they all operate on a single real-time information loop.
But the most fascinating part of this human layer is happening at the village level. The sources detail the revival of village defense committees, or VDCs, particularly in vulnerable districts like Anantnag.
This represents a critical shift in how security is managed. These committees are made up of local residents, but they are not just informal neighborhood watches.
Right.
They're being structurally integrated into the security apparatus.
I look at the relationship between the high-tech CIBMS and the VDCs like a comprehensive home security system.
Okay, how so?
The smart fence, the laser walls and seismic sensors, that's your high-end motion detector. It pings your phone and tells you something is outside in the dark. But the Village Defense Committee is the guard dog sleeping on your porch.
That is a highly accurate analogy.
They have the local knowledge. They recognize when something is out of place in their own backyard, and they can physically act as the first line of alert before the military even arrives.
Exactly. The VDCs are given proper arms training and specific roles in intelligence gathering. When you blend that hyper-local human intelligence with the macro-level AI and drone surveillance, you create a genuinely formidable deterrent against proxy warfare.
Okay, so India is locking down the border physically and electronically. But what about the diplomatic response?
Right.
If Pakistan is abandoning bilateralism to drag this onto the international stage, how does India counterpunch without escalating to a kinetic conflict?
You hit the adversary where it hurts structurally, their economy. This brings us to the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force.
The global watchdog for money laundering and terror financing.
Yes. So the suspension of the Simla Agreement, coupled with terror incidents like Pahalgam, gives India a very powerful dossier to present to the international community.
Because you can track the money.
Exactly. India's strategic play is to meticulously document the financial trails of these proxy forces.
And then use that evidence to lobby for putting Pakistan back on the FATF gray list.
Which is basically global financial strangulation. Being on the gray list means a country is deemed a high risk for terror financing. It severely restricts their access to international loans from the IMF or the World Bank, and it scares off foreign direct investment.
It's a way of enforcing accountability, using spreadsheets and sanctions instead of bullets.
It is the ultimate non-kinetic weapon. It forces the opposing state to choose between funding proxy warfare or preventing their own economic collapse.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today, moving from the history of the 1970s straight into the electronic warfare of tomorrow.
We really have.
So let's convert this into an answer writing framework. Because if you are drafting a high-scoring analysis, you need strict structure. How do we map this into a 150-word format?
Okay, for a 150-word structure, you start with your intro, that's your Pahalgam trigger, and the Simla suspension.
Keep it crisp?
Right. Then your three body arguments. Number one, the shift to internationalization, so mentioning China or the OIC. Number two, the revival of proxy war and nuclear brinkmanship. And number three, India's technological and grid response.
And the way ahead?
The way ahead is CIBMS and FATF diplomacy. That's your 150 words.
Boom. And if we expand that to a 250-word structure?
For 250 words, you open with the same context, but then you expand the dimensions. You break it down into diplomatic, security, and technological dimensions.
Right, sure breadth.
Exactly. Then you must include a challenges section. This is where you bring in the resource constraints in places like Gurez or Uri and the SARC fallout.
You have to show you understand the limitations, not just the theory.
Spot on. Then your recommendations. That's where you plug in the VDCs and the Israeli tech integration. Finally, your conclusion uses this specific crisis to highlight the broader need for squeezing terror financing via the FATF.
That is a phenomenal blueprint. So for those tracking this briefing to build a comprehensive strategic summary, let's synthesize the core analytical framework. What are the definitive data points you need to anchor your understanding?
Let's lock down the critical details for you with 5 must-remember facts. First, the historical anchor. The Simla Agreement was signed in July 1972 following the 1971 war.
Resulting in the release of those 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war.
Exactly. Second, the legal shift.
Mhm.
It replaced the UN Security Council Resolution 47 framework with strict bilateralism.
Right, and it redesignated the ceasefire line as the line of control.
Yes. Third, the technological countermeasures. India's defense relies on Israeli drone dome technology for radio frequency jamming, Heron TP drones, and AI-driven analytics.
Fourth, the grassroots defense. That's the revival and arming of local village defense committees, specifically noted in NatNag, to act as a localized intelligence and alert system.
And fifth, the diplomatic counteroffensive. Leveraging incidents of proxy warfare to advocate for international financial pressure via the FATF gray list.
And if you are mapping out the dimensions of this crisis, what are the 5 analytical keywords you absolutely must utilize to demonstrate a high-level grasp of the material?
Your analysis needs to center on these concepts: internationalization, nuclear brinkmanship, bilateralism, the counter-infiltration grid, and CIBMS, the Comprehensive Integrated Border Management System.
If we were to distill this entire geopolitical shift into one central strategic focal point, it would be this probable exam question. Evaluate the security implications of abandoning the Simla Agreement and assess the viability of the technological and institutional countermeasures India requires for modern border management.
That perfectly frames the entire challenge.
Here is your 30-second final summary. We are witnessing a historic diplomatic firewall being placed in abeyance. In response to the threat of internationalizing the Kashmir conflict and the looming shadow of proxy warfare, India is rapidly recalibrating.
They have to.
They are shifting away from a reliance on a 1970s piece of paper toward a multi-domain defense posture. This involves deploying AI and smart fencing in brutal terrains, empowering local village militias for human intelligence, and preparing to exert massive international economic pressure through the FATF.
It is a complete transition from diplomatic trust to comprehensive, heavily armed deterrence.
Which leaves us with a final provocative concept to mull over as we close this war room briefing. We started by discussing a treaty that essentially defined territorial integrity with ink on a map back in 1972.
Right.
But as we look at the reality of a line of control today, it raises a massive question about the nature of sovereignty itself. How does a nation successfully enforce a 20th century concept of a border in a 21st century landscape?
It's incredibly difficult.
We aren't just dealing with soldiers marching across a line anymore. The line is being crossed by AI-piloted drones, invisible radio frequencies, cyber surveillance, and decentralized proxy forces. The Simla Agreement might be suspended, but more fundamentally, the very definition of what a border is has completely changed.